So, this is the first of a series of 4 weekends devoted to the subject of the future. Each session or weekend is pretty much self-contained. There's a certain continuity, but it's moving towards the center point from various points on a circumference. In the first weekend, this weekend, we are considering the subject of time and the whole concept of the future. The point of departure I'd like to suggest to you is that time is a social institution, not a physical reality. In other words, there's no such thing as time in the natural world, the world of stars, waters, mountains, clouds, and living organisms. There is, however, rhythm, the rhythm of tides, the rhythm of biological processes. But time, as such, is a social institution just as language, numbers, and concepts are. All measurements, like inches, meters, lines of latitude and longitude, are social conventions, agreements we hold collectively. Now, of course, are we going to take time seriously? That's the big question, and it depends on what you mean. If you don't understand that time is a convention, of course, you take it seriously. If you're driven by time, time is money, time is of the essence. We live in a culture in the Western world where we are literally driven by time. Jules Henry's marvelous work, Culture Against Man, documents to an extraordinary extent how driven this particular culture is. Even the psychologists have adjusted their language. What they used to call instincts, they now call drives. There's a feeling that you've got to meet that deadline. There's something you've got to get to, and people feel driven even when something's going to happen. The natural world, however, is resuming. It is in motion. Time, then, is obviously a way of measuring motion by comparing it with some sort of constant. And in the context of time, that constant is the second, divided into 60 degrees or 360 rotations. And that is time. We cause a pointer to revolve around that circle at a regular speed, and that gives us a constant to compare all kinds of motions and rhythms. So, the clock is just like a ruler, and it's as abstract as a ruler. We must take it just for what it is, which means, in a way, not taking it too seriously. Of course, this doesn't mean that we should melt down all clocks and use them for something else. Conventions and social institutions are very valuable. Corresponding to the watch is the compass, which is also a circle, divided 4 ways: north, south, east, and west. The Buddhists speak of 10 directions because, along with the 8 points of the compass, they add above and below. And in their mythology, they have guardian kings whose duty it is to guard the 10 directions. You see them at the entrances to temples and similar places, acting almost as cosmic traffic cops. After all, it is important that I can meet you at 40 and hashtag 039. Clock in the afternoon at the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. Without this kind of agreement, this convention, we couldn't convene. So, as far as it is important to us to meet, we require these sorts of compasses and time indicators in the vast emptiness of the cosmos. But we must recognize that these things are, in a sense, written across a vast emptiness. The ground of being is alive, like coals. It has nothing you can stand on, nothing you can hold onto or describe, but you can imagine all sorts of things in it. Perhaps the whole physical universe is such an imagination. Yet, there are gradations of reality. We might say that the clock, the lines of latitude and longitude, and things like that, abstractions, have a somewhat flimsy reality. Next in order comes what we ordinarily call the physical world. It's material, it matters, and so it has a somewhat harder reality. And that's where most people stop. They think there's nothing deeper than that. This has to do with the limitations of human consciousness, of conscious attention. Conscious attention is such that it tends to ignore constants. For example, when you move from the Midwest to California, at first you think it's fantastic, so beautiful and lush. But after a few years, you start taking it for granted because it becomes a constant to your consciousness. Similarly, when you listen to recorded music, there's always a kind of electronic hum, but we screen it out and ignore it, and it becomes unconscious. In a similar way, there is a continuum, a something or other in which all phenomena exist, and you ignore it unless it somehow hums. Practices like yoga exercises, Zen meditations, or certain kinds of chemicals can cause your entire sensorium to hum, drawing your attention to the ground of everything you perceive which you ordinarily ignore. This hum might inspire an entirely new religion, a religion without hierarchy or doctrines, just music and ritual, and just hum. If anyone asks what it's all about, you'd say, well, come see. Come along. That would be kind of nice, wouldn't it? I don't know whether such a thing exists, but it ought to. At any rate, this continuum in which everything occurs is, of course, what you are. Because we get absorbed in details, we forget all about it. Deep down within yourself, you know very well that you are that. Consciousness and unconsciousness, coming and going, life and death. They're all modes within this whatever it is that we are. Our identities come and go, our forms, our bodies, our roles, they all oscillate. And so, even though each of us is, in some way, the cosmos and all this universe's ground, we don't know it because we can't make it an item of knowledge. We tend to think that the only kind of knowledge is knowledge of particulars. Yet certain crazy things like being in love or being aware of the ground of being are immensely important in human life, even though they might seem unreasonable from a strictly academic or scientific viewpoint. In this enormous so-called void, we set up two great circles, the time circle and the space circle. We notch them all around, and we use these concepts, which are really in our heads, as constants by which we regulate events. When we lose sight of the conventionality of these things, absorbed in details, unconscious of the totality, we begin to invest emotions in them. For example, at a game like football or chess, we know it's only a game, but as it progresses, our emotions start to be affected. We cheer for one side, perhaps even sympathizing with the underdog. And that's what happened to us when we were born. We entered a gaming room, and what was initially just a game became something we took terribly seriously. We were given roles, and people told us who we are. From babyhood, we were told, this is the way you are. It's not like you to do a thing like that. So the thing is that if you live in this sort of environment, eventually somebody says, and quote, well, we won't insure you, end quote, or, end quote, you're doing this regulation wrong, that regulation wrong, end quote. But the real reason is that you're not being a good consumer. You don't own the right kind of appliances, the right kind of car, the right kind of anything, and so you're considered a bad consumer. You've got to keep on owning. Somebody once made a fantasy about the future where everybody is required by law to possess enormous, flashy cars and fantastic, expensive things, while only great business tycoons are able to get away with driving jalopies and wearing old clothes. But you see, in a situation where you must increase like this, it's simply not viable. What's happening to you is like the way you kill poison oak. You feed it certain hormones that, when painted on the leaves, promote such excessive growth that the plant just blows up. And we're in a situation like that, where our progress is a kind of cancer. We're going to blow up from sheer, end quote, blue, end quote, unless you see we stop. Stop the future. Time has got to stop, and we must create a diversion. At the end of the question period yesterday, I said there was something I would need to address today. This arose because we were discussing the problem of prediction, which is, of course, related to the problem of control. I made a passing reference in yesterday's seminar to the fact that our knowledge of time, our knowledge of the future, what Korzybski calls man's, end quote, time-binding ability, end quote, is an advantage for which we pay a very serious price. To know the future in a conscious way gives you, obviously, a survival advantage. But at the same time, it gives us a vital disadvantage, so that what you gain on the roundabout, you lose on the swings. You gain the ability to plan your future, to invest, to take out insurance, to do all those things that are called, end quote, provident, end quote. But the price you pay for it is anxiety. And you pay this price because you know that you don't know enough. You know, as it were, just enough about the future to try to be profitable, but you don't know enough about the future to be sure providence was done correctly. Therefore, you worry. Therefore, you are concerned with what will happen tomorrow. And it's so extraordinary, that passage in St. Matthew's Gospel where Jesus says, end quote, don't make any anxiety about tomorrow, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, end quote. I am amazed by that because every minister I've ever heard discuss this passage says, end quote, it can't be put into practice, end quote. The church simply never did teach that. It's the most ignored passage in the Gospels, swept under the carpet, so to speak. In a way, it's because Jesus told all sorts of stories to make people think. This one, the image of the flowers of the field and the birds that don't make any plans. He did another one, for example, the story of the Pharisee and the publican. Very interesting because it's extremely funny. Here's the Pharisee who goes up to the front row of the church, stands up, and sort of memorializes God about what a good guy he's been, that he's fulfilled all the duties, and so on. Then there's the publican, who creeps into the back, beats himself on the breast, and says, end quote, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, end quote. Now, having told that story, the situation is completely reversed, because now all the pious folks creep into the back of the church, beat themselves on the breast, and take up that pose of humility as if it were an insult. Today, we would have to tell the tale exactly the other way around and say the honest guy is the one who simply walks straight to the front and addresses God man to man. But you see, what people don't realize in what I would call, end quote, gurumanship, end quote, the art of teaching, is that the teacher tells tales not for their immediate, obvious meaning but for their later effect. What is the result of having told the story? In this story, humility is completely deflated. When you try to be humble, it's a con. In the same way, that passage about, end quote, be not anxious for the morrow, end quote, really asks you, end quote, why can't you put this into practice? End quote. Here's a precept, but nobody follows it. They say, end quote, oh, it's impossible. We cannot give up making plans. We cannot give up prediction, end quote. Of course, we predict in a way, in a sort of unconscious fashion. The simplest act involves a kind of prediction. In this sense, we are simultaneously aware of things which, if you regard the present as a hairline, would be called, end quote, past, end quote, and, end quote, future, end quote, at once. But if you're not hung up on the idea that the present is this hairline, purely abstract thing, then you have no problem accepting the idea that we are simultaneously aware of past events and future events. It's like watching from a moving vehicle. You can see where you're going, and you can see where you have been from where you are now. So, in that sense, we have a knowledge of the future. When I move to pick up my glasses, that is a different kind of knowledge from when I speculate in an abstract way about what I ought to do a month from now or what might happen. So then, the question becomes, we predict those far futures which are not within our present vision, by calculation. It may be astronomical or navigational calculation, or it was, in old times, astrological. People thought astrology was a means to foresee the future, to know what to do. And then the question arises, suppose there is a fine science of prediction, whether it be scientifically respectable like navigation or meteorology or something like astrology, are these really profitable sciences? Now, I pointed out that the problem is, when you know the future, you pay for it with anxiety. You know you're going to die. A creature that doesn't make predictions like a cat or a dog, when seeing another dead cat, will not necessarily think, end quote, that's going to happen to me, end quote. Because you see, a truly functioning entity is not self-conscious in that way. For example, you all know that only other people have heads. How did you become concerned with your head? Because you have been made conscious of your face. You've looked in mirrors, and it's the only part of our body that we leave permanently exposed. Even when we put gloves on, our faces are always naked. You learned that you're, end quote, there, end quote, in terms of having a face. But if you were living naturally, you'd be as unself-conscious about your head as your heart or brain, which isn't even sensitive to probes. To really live, you and hashtag 039D need to become as unself-conscious as your head. Because the real, end quote, you, end quote, is everything you see, hear, touch, and sense, not just your face. The wise man, in a way, returns to that original emptiness behind the face. So then, when you start calculating and projecting, you're trying to get hold of all this. But many people have an instinctive reaction when confronted with a great astrologer who could tell them the future. They say, end quote, I don't want to hear it, end quote. This is